Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. User Steelcan909 here. This time I'm joined by another podcast host, and I will go ahead and let him introduce himself, and we can jump right on into the topic that we have at hand.
Hi there, my name is Dominic Perry. I am the host of the History of Egypt podcast that has been running since about 2013 and is doing a chronological history of the Nile Valley and its people and their interactions with the wider world. Yeah, that's about all I can say. That's what I do. I tell stories about ancient Egypt primarily and a little bit about their neighbors. And it's been going really well for the past 10 or 12 years. So lovely to be here.
So let's dive right into it then with the history of the Nile Valley. Your episode 1 starts with the end of the pre-dynastic period of Egypt and into what we now call, and forgive me if I butcher the terminology, I am not an Egyptologist or even an historian, into the Old Kingdom, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so we have, I guess broadly speaking, just to give the context for everyone, ancient Egyptian history is broken up into several distinct phases, purely for convenience. We have the prehistoric or pre-dynastic era, which you can date anywhere from 200,000 BC up to, say, 3000 BC approximately, or BCE. I prefer BCE, but doesn't matter. Around 3000 BC, the various small chiefdoms or cities or kingdoms of the Nile Valley in what we now call Egypt consolidate into a single monarchical state. And we call that the unification. That begins in a period that is called the early dynastic, broadly speaking, goes for about 300 years. Around 2700, we get the appearance of pyramids, and that's kind of where we start the Old Kingdom, which runs for about 500 years. That collapses. What follows is a period of chaos, and then the Middle Kingdom, which is another sort of golden age. Then that collapses, another period of chaos and division, then followed by the New Kingdom, which is probably, along with the Pyramid Age, is the most famous period in terms of public awareness, how much people know about ancient Egypt. The New Kingdom is the time of Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, Ramesses the Great, those kind of figures. That runs for about 500 or 600 years before it collapses, more like 500. And then we have what we call the late period, which runs mostly during the first millennium BC. And then after that, we get the Persian, then the Macedonian or Hellenistic era, then the Roman, and then we start moving into medieval, early modern. So it's a very, 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 very long history. But yeah.
I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with some of those fun little factoids about Cleopatra and the age of the pyramids.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You know, Egypt is so old that even well before they passed their zenith, they already had what we might call ancient historians. By the time of, say, Ramesses the Great, for example, the kingdom was already close to 2,000 years old. So, and he's more than 1,000 years before Cleopatra. So I think for most countries on Earth, it's quite hard to imagine the sheer time scale that we deal with in Egypt. But it is, like, as you say, Cleopatra is closer to the moon landing than she is to the construction of the Great Pyramid. It's by a factor of several centuries. You know, it's that kind of gap.
When we're looking at these big narrative overviews of, like you said, all of Egyptian history covering thousands and thousands of years, the approach that you've taken with the podcast is chronological, right? Starting with the pre-dynastic or at the end of the pre-dynastic, and currently I haven't caught up 100% on the series. I'm still at the ascent of Ramesses II to the throne. I'm not entirely sure the terminology there.
Yep.
To the throne. How do you find that the stories that you're looking at in ancient Egypt have grown on you in terms of, like, what are some of the narratives that you've looked at in this kind of big broad scope of thousands of years that might not necessarily have been something you were particularly familiar with before you started this project?
So over time, I'll say one of the most sort of difficult things about the early periods is how little we really know about some of the people and their personalities or their deeds. We know a lot about the institutions that they created from a very early period, the institution of kingship being the classic one. That's basically how we start the record of their history, is with the appearance of kings, which I guess is true for many cultures. Once the state solidifies, that's when historians are able to discuss a concrete entity, which is Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, that kind of thing. Greece, give or take. The things that would probably surprise the average person is, for example, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, one of the most famous monuments in the world, subject of endless discussion and analysis and interpretation by people from all walks of life with all kinds of perspectives. Strangely enough, the man who commissions that, King Khufu, we know barely anything about him as a person or as a ruler. We have a few tiny traces of his reign, things like mining expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula, things like that, or government surveys of the country. We know that those are happening. But as a person, as a ruler, we can't tell a biography of King Khufu. All we have is his pyramid. And weirdly enough, we know a lot more about the people around Khufu, like his courtiers, his family members. We have much more information about them than we actually do the king, which might sound quite strange. We are so used to thinking of history, especially monarchies, with a big focus on the ruler, the age of Victoria, the age of Louis XIV, this kind of thing. We can't do that with some of those early figures, which is quite frustrating. By the time of, say, Ramesses II, where the narrative is currently sitting, we have an order of magnitude greater, more information about every single level of society. We have, for example, letters written by ordinary people to their family members, to their colleagues, on different aspects of their daily life that they were experiencing or that they were dealing with, which gives us a much better picture of ancient Egyptian society around 1300 than even just a millennium before. It's night and day in terms of what we can say. In terms of stories that surprise me, I'm very much one of those people who I love any little tale about daily life that I can get into. Kings and monarchies and government institutions are important, obviously, and they leave a very significant record. But in terms of what I perceive to be the goal of history, which is to better understand ourselves as a species and how we behave, there's no substitute for a good little daily life record. For example, one that I was just sort of writing and recording on the story on the podcast, we have amazing collections of small letters from people, like one written by a scribe who he worked in the village of Deir el-Medina, that's where the builders who made the Valley of the Kings lived, around 1300 BCE. Highly skilled craftsmen, often literate, who left a huge amount of written material. But there's one letter that I really love, which I was just sort of digging into a bit more recently, of this one little chap who's in charge of a work team. And he writes a letter to his father, who's a local bigwig, somewhere else in the administration. And he's complaining to his father because his father asked him to take another guy on as a worker. We don't know I can't remember the name of this guy off the top of my head, but basically this letter writer is complaining to his dad that you told me to hire this guy, but he's really lazy. We send him off to bring water from the well or the Nile, and he takes all day to do it. It should only take a couple of hours, but he takes all day. And it's nighttime, and he still hasn't come back. And it's this one fantastic little letter, and I have no idea what the aftermath of that was. Did the guy get fired? Did they sort it out? But it's so recognizably human, the lazy coworker who everyone in the team is getting annoyed at. And we just have it from 3,300 years ago, and that's awesome.
Looking then at that kind of historical voice, especially the ones that we often don't get to see in the story of institutions and so on, how difficult is it to go through and look at the voices of these ancient people and separate it both from the language that they're using? I cannot read Egyptian. I cannot claim to it, but reading other languages, things like Latin and Old English and so on, it can present a bit of a barrier towards fully understanding everything that they're going through, because we have differences in languages, we have differences in how we approach these topics. And then there's also issues of form, right? Like, you have particular literary tropes and styles. Are there any particular voices that you think can kind of cut through all of that? Are there any of those stories that you would like to tell?
It certainly depends on, I think, what you're interested in fundamentally as a person. We have the same issues with ancient Egyptian as we probably do with any language, like Latin or Old English, which is that at the end of the day, it's a dead language. Ancient Egyptian has its descendants in the form of Coptic, which is a language in Egypt today. That is you'd call it like the great grandson of ancient Egyptian. Similar enough, but still massive differences. But fundamentally, ancient Egyptian is dead as a spoken and written language. And even more importantly, the translation of ancient Egyptian is only just over 200 years old. It was the first official decipherment that was legit was published in 1822. So it's literally 203 years old that scholars have been deciphering ancient Egyptian accurately. Before that, plenty of people had tried from, the Arab scholars and Europeans, but they never got it. They never had the right sort of approach that managed to unlock it. So from that perspective, ancient Egyptian is much younger in terms of translation than Greek or Latin, which scholars have been working on for 500, 600, 700, 1,000 years. To a certain extent, the translation of Latin never stopped. It carried on through the early medieval and late higher medieval periods, even if the understanding has evolved. With that lengthy preamble out of the way, there are 100% nuances and things that have simply been lost from ancient Egyptian. And I think the biggest example of that would be in their religious literature, because the inscriptions that survive on the walls of temples or in tombs, the people writing those were primarily priests, and then scribes were copying them onto walls, and stonemasons were copying from a papyrus in order to carve onto the walls. But the priests and religious theologians, if you will, who composed these texts, they were working from an understanding of the world that hasn't survived in writing, if that makes sense. Where they're getting these stories of great gods like Usir, Osiris, or Ise, Isis, they know exactly what they're talking about, but the ways they're communicating that onto a temple wall can be incredibly obscure. They'll reference something that happened in a god's story or life, and we have no idea what they're referencing, but it was perfectly legible to them. They were like, oh, of course they're talking about that. So that really obfuscates their perception of the natural world and the divine world, which we always have to keep in mind is a very important part of their understanding of reality and the world. For them, most of the invisible or immaterial forces, gravity and things like that, or the wind, those were fundamentally caused by gods because they didn't understand the natural phenomena that create them. So I think a lot has been lost in terms of that, where we simply, no matter how hard scholars try, there are just always going to be massive gaps in how we understand their particular view of the world. We can do our best to untangle it, and we get some basic principles, but to a large extent, their worldview is going to remain quite alien because nobody sat down and explained every single component of that, which is exactly what's going to happen to our society, 3,000 years from now, when aliens conquer Earth and start uncovering 20th century thought. There's going to be a lot of things that we never thought to write down and we never thought to explain fully that will have been lost. Which is kind of why I like the daily life stuff that I mentioned earlier, because a lot of that is very recognizable. It's people having arguments with their spouse. It's people worrying about, the harvest hasn't been good this year, or make sure we need to take this delivery of goods down to the local city to sell it, and we need to do it soon because otherwise it's going to go bad. Things like that. Or even just simple arguments between people, a chap who rents or loans his donkey out to somebody else, and the guy hasn't brought it back. And he's like, for the love of God, it's been a year. Give me back my donkey, please. Things like that. So to go back to the sort of the translation question, there are always going to be huge sections of their worldview that A, were never written down, and B, even when there were so many assumptions that they didn't write down that we're just never going to be able to reconstruct those, which is a shame. But there is still plenty of excellent material to uncover.
When you've been going through these various different time periods and the changes in institutions, governments, and so on, what are some of the through lines that you look back at in ancient Egyptian history for, I don't want to say necessarily continuity, because that gets into that kind of the idea that ancient Egypt didn't change. But what are some of the... Go ahead.
Yeah, so let's talk about that really quickly, because it is quite important for the general public, especially now where we live in an age of rampant misinformation and disinformation spreading online. There's a perception of ancient Egypt which has been partly fed by sort of short form documentaries and things, that it's all just one thing, that it appears fully formed around 3000 BC and doesn't change until the death of Cleopatra. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are certain elements of ancient Egyptian society which do show great continuity, and one of those is the artistic style. They figured out early on a form of two-dimensional art which they considered to be high quality, perfect. It did what it needed to do. It wasn't art for art's sake. It was art as communication or art as memorial. The figures you see on the wall of a tomb, they're not just there to look pretty and to be aesthetic. They are there to record important information about the deceased or about the life they want to lead in the next world. So their art, relatively early on, sort of crystallized in a way that they continued for thousands of years. That being said, the more familiar you become with the art, the more you start to see it does change over time. The details change, the ways that they'll draw certain scenes or the type of scenes themselves will change. I can look at a piece of two-dimensional art and say, oh, that's Old Kingdom, or that's even 4th Dynasty, as opposed to that which is clearly 12th or 18th. To a casual viewer, you're not going to get that, but it's kind of like how an art historian will be able to tell you which part of the Renaissance that particular piece of art came from, even though there is a consistent sort of style across periods. The details do change quite significantly. When it comes to the language certainly evolves. The Old Egyptian, as we call it, is very complex and arcane in its grammar. Almost like, sort of Old English. Everything is more wordy and more frustrating to translate, especially if you're a student. It's like Old Egyptian just does your head in. But then you get what they call Middle Egyptian, which is kind of your high classical style. And that's a style they like to keep around for temples and religious texts, because even they decided at a certain point that's the refined style. But eventually we start to see that separate, where you have Middle Egyptian being used for sort of classical texts like temples. But then royal inscriptions and daily life are being written in a form that we call late Egyptian, which is another later stage of the written language. So even then, like, the language itself kind of separates into two tiers, and it depends on the context which one they're going to use. And then you have just fundamental things like the institutions themselves. Ancient Egyptian kingship at the start is not the same as it is 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later. It just has certain visual points that appear the same, but there's a great deal of change. Yeah.
When you've been looking at the course of Egyptian history in the project that you've been undertaking, has this changed your academic focus on Egyptian history at all? Did you start going in like, oh, I want to do 18th dynasty art, and then moving over into something like Fourth Kingdom, or Fourth Dynasty, excuse me?
Not so much. Maybe. Personally, I've stepped away from the academic environment quite significantly over the past few years. Basically, after sort of COVID, I sort of stepped away. I was doing a PhD for a while in New Zealand, but due to various factors, I ultimately withdrew from that. Now the podcast is just my full-time focus. But I do know that if I was, when I go back to academia to start participating directly again, there are certain things that I will focus on differently. So my first postgraduate research was on the end of the 18th dynasty, which, for those unfamiliar, is the time of, say, Tutankhamun, his potential father, Akhenaten, and the strange religious decisions of that period, which then gets swept aside by a ruler named Horemheb. And Horemheb was a military general under Tutankhamun who ultimately wound up seizing power for himself after Tutankhamun had died, and after a little bit of politicking with other people. He took power for himself, made himself the pharaoh, and then, because he didn't have any sons or daughters who could carry on his political legacy, he chose one of his generals, a man named Ramesses, to be the next king. And then Ramesses had a son named Seti, became Seti I. He had a son who became Ramesses II, and that starts one of the more famous dynasties. Horemheb was my first postgraduate focus, and that hasn't really gone away. I do quite like Horemheb as a subject. I don't know what he was like as a man, but as an example of Egyptian society at that time, I think that's quite a fascinating phase. But my other postgraduate research, my master's degree specifically, focused on the Old Kingdom with the economy of the temples attached to the pyramids. We have wonderful papyrus archives from some of the later pyramid temples, about a century after the Great Pyramid, where we have really detailed records of the priests doing their daily operations, receiving deliveries of supplies, how all that material like meat, bread, vegetables, and things gets used and then distributed to the priests, because, we think of them as offerings to the gods, which is true, but once they've done that offering, they don't just throw it out. They take it, they eat it, they consume it for themselves, and it all kind of gets distributed through the organization. So there's an important economic factor to those temples, which is not that widely appreciated. When we talk about temples, people tend to focus on the religious component, but for the Egyptians, the economic was equally, if not more important for the day-to-day than the religious side of things. Temples were basically corporations in an ancient sense, and they were quite important in their communities in that respect. When I do eventually go back to academia, I suspect that I'll continue sort of by combining those two interests, the New Kingdom, Horemheb, and the economic temple side of things. But we'll see. Yeah.
You mentioned having a particular fondness for Horemheb as a subject rather than a person. I think we can all agree that many of the historical figures in history would probably not be pleasant people to sit down and have a drink with. Of the various people that you've looked at, whether they are, I mean, maybe you can answer this, the stories that we get from the daily life, do we have things like names and, you know, lifespans and so on for these people, or is it just we have this one letter about this guy complaining about his lazy coworker, and that's it?
Um, it depends. So, how detailed do you want me to go on this? I could go pretty detailed. I'll pick two examples. In terms of the monarchs, for example, Ramesses II is an excellent choice because he himself reigned a long time. 67 years is the highest known regnal date, and he came to power when he was about 20, so already mature enough to be an active force politically and to really enact his will. Which means that over that 67 years, Ramesses and his government and his architect and his masons had a lot of opportunities to create magnificent monuments that have stood the test of time. You know, a big part of why rulers become famous is just, do they live long enough to actually leave a lasting legacy? Now, these days, in the current cultural zeitgeist of the early 21st century, there's kind of an anti-Ramesses sentiment in the popular imagination, at least for people who are enthusiastic about ancient Egypt. There's a sense that he's too bombastic, too monumental, too grandiose, or arrogant, or, you know, a blowhard is a word I often hear. The thing about that is that Ramesses only did what every other ruler before him had done. He just happened to reign long enough to do it on a much larger scale than those who came before, and they have survived very well. So there's that kind of element of, I don't actually think Ramesses was more grandiose or more arrogant than your average pharaoh. We just have more evidence for it, which might be its own proof for some people. But then beyond that sort of monumental record, we have a huge amount of information about the man himself, partly because his mummy survives, his corpse. It survives in beautiful condition, and it has been studied with, you know, modern forensic technology to the extent that we can understand a great deal about his life. You know, that he was, for example, he probably had reddish hair. The hair of his mummy was dyed red with henna, but microscopic analysis of the hair itself showed that within the roots of the hair, there was still red coloring, if that makes sense. Like, still, he'd lost most of his hair color by the time he died, but there was still, the roots kind of preserve the last vestiges and show that he was probably a natural redhead. But we also know that by the end of his life, he had terrible arthritis. He was probably bent over double with a walking stick because he was in his late 80s at a time when your average person would have been dead by 50. We know that his diet was pretty good for his society, obviously, because he's whatever he needs, he can get. But even then, he still had terrible abscesses in his teeth because of the grit in the bread from, like, sand. So by the time he died, we know a lot about his physical health and condition, which really allows us to sort of construct a picture of the man. And then finally, we also have an excellent record of letters that he sent to places like the king of the Hittites. We have a wonderful archive from Boazkoi, or Hattusa, the Hittite capital, that preserve letters sent from Ramesses, his mother, his wife, to the court of Hatti, negotiating about different things, communicating, but they preserve the words of the king himself, you know, and the personality he takes on diplomatically, which is kind of a strange mix of very friendly, but also quite sort of, on occasion, almost kind of sarcastic. There's one really fun example where the Hittite king sent a letter to Ramesses because the queen of Hatti, or her sister or something like that, I forget the exact relationship off the top of my head, she was unable to conceive a child. And so the king of Hatti sent a letter to the pharaoh saying, hey, could you send me one of your physicians? Because ancient Egyptian physicians or doctors are renowned for their skills. And Ramesses writes back saying, basically, look, I know the woman you're talking about. I've heard about her. She's in her 50s. There is nothing on heaven and earth that any doctor can do that is going to allow her to bear a child. That window has passed. And the way he phrases it is really quite funny in a sort of sarcastic sense of, just basically like, dude, come on, accept it. It's not going to happen. I can send a doctor, but that's going to waste his time. It's going to waste your time. It's going to waste my time. Let's just drop it. And it's funny. Like, it's, you feel bad for the people involved in this, but it's funny as hell. Like, you can really imagine Ramesses in his throne room being like, what? Like, come on. And then the letter writers kind of have to massage that into something a bit more diplomatic. So that kind of stuff comes through in the written record, and it's really fun. Outside the royal sphere, as I mentioned, the sort of that period of like Ramesses II and the few generations after, they're really well recorded in terms of different people. And to give you one example, we have, for example, a scribe who works in that village I mentioned earlier, Deir el-Medina, where the tomb builders live. And his full name is Ken Kher Kopeshef, but I'll just call him Ken. He's one of the top scribes in the community. So he's literate, he can read and write, and he has a lot of important administrative work to do. So he's constantly writing letters, which is great because a lot of those letters have survived and we can see him, dealing with business. But he also leaves kind of inscriptions carved, like graffiti carved on little places all over the region. So we can track him over the course of his life, being like, he was working here at this point, or he was working in this valley around here. And we can even get right down to things of saying like, oh, this guy, he's a top scribe, but his handwriting is awful. Like, it's like the ancient equivalent of a doctor. Like, it's a scrawl. And usually the way Egyptologists work with this material is that if it's the handwritten form, they have to sit down and figure out, okay, what hieroglyph is he actually drawing here? Because they don't draw the hieroglyphs in full detail like they would on a temple. They just kind of scribble it out, kind of a cursive style. And sometimes with this guy, it can be really hard to figure out what word he's actually using because his handwriting is so bad. Even though he's the top scribe, he can read, he can write, it's fine. But the way he writes, oof, it's painful. And stuff like that, that's just one example, is really fun. And then we get lots more, especially over later generations when the power of the state sort of weakens and local leaders begin to have more and more power and influence. We get really great records from them, arguing with each other, negotiating, getting into legitimate conspiracies with each other, not like criminal conspiracies, basically, kind of almost like mafia, we need to take care of that person. Like, that person knows something they're not supposed to. I want you to get rid of that person. Stuff like that. Really cool.
So this is a question that I've actually had for a while about ancient Egyptian history. And I know that you're not here yet in the podcast and the overarching structure, but I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on this. One of the things, especially when we're looking at these kind of big narratives of ancient Egyptian history, that gets left out is the late period.
Yeah.
When you're looking at like a survey of history, if you're doing, the beginning, Stone Age to today,
yep,
you're going to talk about pyramids. You might talk about intermediate period, Hyksos, Tut, Ramses, and then Greece and Macedon and Persia is kind of become center stage.
Yeah.
What's going on in Egypt during the late period?
Okay. A lot.
Yes, please give me your quick thoughts on what I'm sure has filled multiple academic volumes and supplied.
I'm sure that we can summarize what no historian has been able to summarize before. To give you the Cliff Notes version, okay. So around, we'll say around 1200 BCE, you start to get the late Bronze Age collapse is in full swing. The Mycenaean civilization declines, the Hittites decline or potentially collapse and are destroyed. Communities in the Near East suffer badly. Egypt seemingly holds out and sort of weathers that storm to some degree, certainly better than some other polities. But that has its consequences. For example, the king at that time, Ramesses III, famously fights multiple invasions by people coming from what we now call Libya to the west, and the Sea Peoples, who supposedly come by the sea and also to the east through what is now Gaza. He fights these major battles, defeats all of them because the king is always triumphant, takes many prisoners. But then what does he do with those prisoners? He settles them in farming communities in northern Egypt. And we know this because they're recorded in sort of papyrus documents discussing like where a tax assessor is going around the region and saying, okay, this is where that community is living, this is where that community is living, here's how much land they're living on, here's how much tax they need to pay. Really amazing records. But the problem is that Ramesses and the Egyptians, they don't try to break up these communities. They don't try to sprinkle them out through the wider society in order to, I guess, basically erase their political or self-identity consciousness. So naturally, these little communities of Libyans or Sea Peoples, they retain their traditional identity, they retain their traditional organization. And over the decades and centuries that follow, they begin to form their own little power bases in northern Egypt. And that becomes a threat to the king of Egypt itself. And it becomes really fragmented. And then you get kings from what we now call Sudan, at the time was called Kush, actually invading Egypt and presenting themselves as liberators to kick out these Libyans and these northerners and to defeat them and stamp them back down. And the Nubian kings, who formed the 25th dynasty, they sort of take an approach, the way their communication goes is they say, we are here to liberate you from the Libyans. We are bringing the old ways back. You know, the obvious parallel is obvious. We are restoring greatness and bringing back, you know, the worship of the proper gods in the classical ways. They basically try to present themselves as more Egyptian than the Egyptians. You know, like, you guys have fallen off. We're bringing this back. Come on. And they hold power for like a good couple of hundred years or so, off the top of my head. But unfortunately, in the wake of the Bronze Age collapses in the Near East, you start getting powers like Assyria and Babylon reconsolidating, re-rising, as it were, after earlier periods. And eventually the Assyrians are able to invade Egypt, and they occupy a large chunk of the country. Then the Assyrians ultimately get sort of replaced by the Persians, who, and I'm really simplifying here, it's terrible, and they get replaced by the Macedonians, who form the Hellenistic kingdom, obviously. But through this period, through these several centuries, you get these sort of sometimes multi-generational sort of resistances or flare-ups in Egyptian independence, where they'll kick the invaders out and re-establish their kingdom, and it will last for like 100 years until the next big dog on the scene shows up and causes problems again. And within that time, there is a constant sort of background level of trade and travel and communication going across the Near East and across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Because, you know, while these big royal things are happening, 99% of the population barely notices or barely cares. You know, royals and nobles doing their thing, unless they come stomping through with an army, it doesn't affect us. So, for example, in those centuries, say around 700, 600 approximately, you start to get more and more people coming from the Aegean or Greece as traders and as workers, and they start to settle in little communities in northern Egypt. And some of these communities have been excavated, like Naucratis and Donis Heraklion, which are they're underwater now, and you have to dig them up from underneath the harbors. Really cool stuff. And the kings themselves try to sort of navigate this newly cosmopolitan world that they're interacting with. And one of my favorite examples is that there's a king commonly known as Amasis, but his actual name is Ahmose, and he's the second Ahmose. The first one was several centuries earlier. But Ahmose II hears about an earthquake that damages the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi in Greece. And Ahmose II is a pious king. He thinks, well, we can't have a god's sanctuary, damaged like this, even though it's 1,000,000 miles away. Let's send them some silver to help them pay for the reconstruction. Really cool, like an early form of international aid from Egypt to Greece to repair this very important sanctuary to Apollo. Pardon me. And then all the way through this, you have just constant sort of settlement, immigration, interaction between the peoples who are creating their own little lifestyles, where the gods start to get combined. A Greek god will get combined with an Egyptian, or a Greek hero like Heracles will start to get assimilated with an ancient Egyptian deity, and they form their own new gods who are worshipped and honored. So broadly speaking, it's like, I guess the way you would think about the late period is this really, really dynamic period, especially in art and writing and storytelling and religious activity. Well, the religious actually sort of becomes quite conservative in a interesting way. But it's this period where almost like Egypt's imperial power is declining somewhat, but their on the ground ordinary folks are way more visible and dynamic than they had been for centuries, and it's really cool. I'm sure I've missed out a lot there. There's a lot more I could talk about, but essentially the late period is like this really amazing but sadly overlooked phase of their history. People sort of jump from like Ramesses III, and then they just go straight to Alexander, and everything in between, forget about it.
So that does get into a little bit some of the other things that I wanted to talk about, which is Egyptology more as a field rather than some of these specific duties. And so you mentioned that Egyptology, in terms of its legacy compared to some of the other, like a classics degree or something, or a medievalist degree, is a little bit more recent because we've only been able to read things like hieroglyphs for a comparatively shorter amount of time.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what is it like to work in the field of Egyptology? Because I would consider your podcast to be in the field of Egyptology, even if you're not an academic, and maybe that's the outsider perspective.
Sure.
How do you see Egyptology having changed in the past several, I don't want to say centuries, because we can go back to, I just read a book, I think it was Toby Wilkinson's History of Egyptology as a Field.
Yep.
Obviously, we don't need to go all the way back to
sure
the quote unquote like golden age of Egyptology, but how have things changed as technology, role of academia, and so on has shifted in the past several decades?
That's an interesting sort of way to look at it. At the start, I will go back to the start sort of briefly just to set the template to see how it changes. Almost basically, if we take Jean-Francois Champollion as the first Egyptologist, he's the man who first effectively deciphered hieroglyphs. If you take him as the first quote-unquote Egyptologist, at that time, the folks who studied Egypt or came to study Egypt professionally, for the most part, they were classicists, first and foremost. They trained in Latin, they trained in Greek, they trained in Hebrew or other biblical languages, and then they sort of started to transpose, I should say, some of those skills to Egypt and the Nile Valley. And that brought with it, that probably lasted, I'd say, for about 90 years, easily. That brought with it all kinds of preconceptions and assumptions about what the ancient Egyptian civilization was. Even just something so fundamental as, trying to figure out which pharaoh was the pharaoh of the Exodus. who was the pharaoh who talked to Moses? Generations of early Egyptologists were very interested in that question, and they took it as a given that, the Exodus had happened and that Moses was a real person and that he did speak to a pharaoh and say, let my people go. Subsequently, from within the early 20th century, you start to get archaeology as a skill rapidly gaining prominence and saying, hold on, we can't just look at texts and art. We have to look at what is in the ground and what that tells us factually about the people and what they were doing. And you need both of those skills in order to tell the full story, because archaeology can't tell you what people were thinking, just as art cannot tell you exactly how they were living at a very basic level. So I would then say that, from the early 20th century, you sort of get the hybrid model where archaeology is becoming more and more important, but those old ways of doing Egyptology were still the main driving force. Subsequently, starting in the 60s to 70s, you get the sort of the big wave of archaeological science, where it really starts to become its own academic discipline, not just connected to these other fields. It starts to develop its own internal methodology and techniques, and basically branches off to now you can, if you talk to academics, they might not call themselves an Egyptologist. They might say, oh, no, I am an Egyptian archaeologist. I am an archaeologist who specializes in Egypt, but I'm an archaeologist first and foremost. And that happens on the history side of things too. If you asked me academically to define myself, I would say I'm a historian first and foremost. That's where my skill set and my passion lies. Now in the 21st century, Egyptology is quite anxious, as a general sort of statement, is quite anxious to legitimize itself scientifically. And depending on your point of view, this is either long overdue or it's a fool's errand. And I'll qualify that quite importantly. Fundamentally, there are so many aspects of this society, this ancient society, which are irretrievably lost. It's been too long. There are too many factors that have, affected the information. There are too many aspects of their lifestyle, of their world, of the environment they inhabit, which we simply cannot imagine or understand intuitively. We can try to reconstruct their physical environment through archaeological studies that drill down into the soil and figure out what the landscape was like. But at the end of the day, we can't imagine we can't intuitively understand what the Eastern Sahara and the Mediterranean were like 3,000 years ago. So we don't have that practical experience which you need. This goes into kind of every aspect of Egyptology and it's one that is quite common for people to criticize in the public domain, which is like, at the end of the day, you can't really know anything about ancient Egypt. You have what they've left behind, but unless you have a time machine and a video camera, you can't exactly know how they built the pyramids, how they raised obelisks, what happened at the Battle of Kadesh, how Cleopatra died and where she's buried. There are some questions where you can't objectively or empirically prove one way or the other how things went. And that's true. And so for some specialists within the field, it sort of comes down to, there's always going to be those gaps. So we shouldn't try to establish ourselves as like science on the same level as physics or mathematics. Maths either works or it doesn't. Either it's 1 or it's 0. Either it's valid or it's not. But history is about people, and people are not easily defined in a binary sense. And what I mean by that is you can never prove it is fundamentally one way or the other with the ancient past. It all comes down to interpretation of the material. So, and I don't know how much I subscribe to this personally, but for some scholars, there's no point trying to make Egyptology a science because it's not pure enough to be a proper science.
A quick question on that. Is there, and so obviously in a lot of contemporary academic disciplines, especially in the humanities, there is a great deal of anxiety over, we're not a science. If we were a science, we'd get to have a whole lot more funding. We'd get to have a whole lot more, I don't want to say prestige necessarily, but a whole lot more. Maybe prestige is the right word. Is that at work here as well, or is it just trying to define itself as separate from history and archaeology and so on?
I think it's definitely part of that larger cultural movement, because when you look at history as a field, it's usually defined as one of the quote unquote soft sciences, which kind of gives you a sense of how, and I can only speak for, English language Western societies here, how we perceive history, sociology, psychology, studies of people are often seen as less prestigious, maybe, but certainly less meaningful or useful, I think would be the key word, compared to something like physics or maths. Physics and maths can build you a machine that'll help you find oil. It'll help you send those rockets to the asteroid belt to mine the ingredients we need for our mega corporations. History can't do that. History's going to say, well, people tried that back then. That's probably not a good idea. Or history's going to produce the kind of people who are more likely to be critical of the society in which they live. And again, only speaking for Western societies, we don't tend to value those people as much. We don't see them as useful. We don't value philosophers or artists or historians in the same material way that we do scientists or business people. And, obviously anyone listening to this, there's going to be some people who instinctively jump to, well, this is why that we do that. This is why we do that. Yeah, sure. Okay. Depending on your point of view, there might be valid reasons for that. But historical fields in general, for decades, have been slowly losing ground in the funding war. Because academic institutions constantly rely on donations, either from private philanthropy or from government educational funds. So universities really are not as independent as they would like to tell themselves that they are. And with that in mind, they put the resources where they are most likely to get them visibility and more funding. And this is true for every field. Scientific, humanities, whatever. Everyone is just trying to get more funding so that they can fund more research or more work in their particular field. History, historically, does not have the greatest success rate in doing that. The golden age, as you mentioned earlier, was back when wealthy philanthropists would fund excavations in countries not just because they thought it was worthwhile and interesting, but because they also thought, whatever we dig up, I'm going to get some of that and I can put it in my cabinet of curiosities at home, in my private collection, or I can donate it to a museum and I will get prestige from that. There are many ways to earn prestige, and archaeology, history, and Egyptology have certainly played their parts in that. But ultimately, it does come down to that very transactional economy. Who's giving the resources? How do we get the resources? What do we have to do to get those? Recently, historians have been trying to become a bit more scientific in hopes of getting a bit more funding. But maybe it's a fool's errand, maybe not. I don't know. Sorry, that was a very wordy answer.
One of the things that I did want to ask about, and you mentioned this a little bit, is you're coming at the study of Egypt from a decidedly Western perspective. But one of the big changes in Egyptology and history of Egypt, probably over the past century, is that Egyptians are allowed to do it now. That it's not just people from the Anglosphere, from the United States and Germany and France and so on, who are doing Egyptology and history of Egypt and archaeology of Egypt. And I wanted to know, is there anything that you can illuminate or explain a little bit about how that has changed the field within the past century? Is probably a little bit much, but at least since independence, which is the 50s, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the first Egyptian Egyptologists started to be formally trained in the early 1900s and began to gain prominence with the independence movement and those changes between, say, 1910 and 1950. Whereas if you turned up in Egypt in 1900, all of the archaeological institutions, including the museums, were controlled by French, German, Anglophone individuals. Now they're all controlled domestically by Egyptians, sometimes in contract with companies from other countries. Yeah. So and then basically from the 1950s onwards, you start to find Egyptians leading their own archaeological projects a lot more visibly and a lot more self-sufficiently, in conjunction with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, by whatever name it was at the time. That has been important for their society in a few ways, because in terms of geopolitics, Egypt has, for the past couple of hundred years, and arguably for all of its history, had to straddle a very fine line between the African continent, which it is officially a part of, the Mediterranean, which it connects to, and the Middle East, which it connects to. Egypt is very much a crossroads country. And in the past 200 years, especially with the advent of things like the Suez Canal, the collapse of the old empires following World War I, the rise of the new Middle East after the Balfour Declaration, and all the stuff that has happened subsequently, with the Cold War and things, Egyptian society and the Egyptian government and the people have had to walk a very fine line between the West and the East, both in political, economic, military, all kinds of spheres. And to forestall any, sort of person commenting on this, that has been for good and ill, depending on your point of view, in whatever regard. What Egyptian-led archaeology has really done, I think, and what I've seen in terms of my experience with the culture, is given them a much deeper appreciation of their history as a geographical and social entity. Egyptians today are much more engaged with the ancient past than they would have been 40 years ago, 100 years ago. Obviously, I've only been visiting Egypt for about 15 years, but from my studies of their society and from what I hear anecdotally, especially from the older generation, it's night and day in terms of how engaged young Egyptians are with their ancient past. It's not just a sort of relic to them anymore. It's a cohesive part of their national identity. And that's cool. That's really good. Like, for any country, it'd be great if everybody in any country had a deep appreciation of their history. So that is a plus side of that kind of push. In terms of how else it's changed, what has also changed, I think, to a large extent, and this is probably true for many societies that have experienced this, is that basically since the 1970s, Egypt has started to experience mass market tourism. Before the 1970s, when aviation and sea travel sort of suddenly became a lot more commercialized and accessible to everybody in Western societies, not just the upper middle class and elite. Before that, travelers to Egypt were primarily those wealthier groups. Now you have the vast industries that are cruise ship operators, travel companies, bringing millions of people through the country every year. And on the one hand, that's quite good for the locals. It means money's constantly coming in from the outside, which is usually quite helpful for a society. The downside, of course, is that it's meant that the Egyptian economy is massively dependent on tourism now, to a much greater extent than it was previously, which creates its own tensions within the society, its own challenges. How do you deal with this many people coming through? How do you deal with this kind of influx of foreign money in a way that is both sustainable and also takes care of that archaeological heritage. The mass tourism at Giza, for anybody who's visited it, will see that it's almost like Disneyland in terms of the number of people that come through Giza on a daily basis. And that can't be good for the monuments in the long haul, people clambering on pyramids constantly. Just even at just a basic level, no matter how well it's managed, how carefully it's orchestrated, mass tourism is damaging to antiquities of any country. Look at Venice, for example. Look at what is happening to the beautiful architectural and artistic heritage of Venice simply from the cruise ship industry. This mass tourism can be long-term quite devastating. So again, depending on your point of view, you could sort of see it as like a poisoned chalice that the Egyptians have wittingly or unwittingly taken up, which is that the more the world becomes interested in the antiquities of this particular country or any country, the more people come, which has its economic benefits, but also can be quite threatening for the monuments or that heritage long term. And there's, that's not even a criticism. That's a very tricky thing for any society to navigate. At the end of the day, that is, partly a result of Egyptology's own success in bringing this ancient world to life, is that we've created this sort of cycle of public interest, which could be quite damaging to the country long term. Again, I don't think you can lay any of that at the feet of the Egyptians specifically. It's more that they happened to take a greater part in their own heritage and historical work at the same time as this new economic force, which is mass tourism, began to unleash itself across the globe. Again, like the same thing is happening in Italy and Greece or Turkey. Tourism brings benefits to its society, but it can poison the society if it's not managed properly.
I'm an early medievalist. And I will unashamedly admit, I don't think I would be without The Lord of the Rings. Like, that's such a huge influence on medievalism, and most medievalists I've ever met have something similar. In your own experience with Egypt, was there anything that had that same spark that said, oh, this is what I'm interested in?
I got hooked on ancient Egypt when I was about 9, when I had to do a school project about Tutankhamun. And I found the story of his tomb discovery and the treasures within it fascinating. And the image that most comes to me is the third coffin of Tutankhamun. I'll see if I can bring up an image for you. It's the solid gold one, and it has a very distinctive appearance. There's no screen share function on this. But if you look up Tutankhamun third coffin, I think the thing that I like about it is that it doesn't have eyes. Well, it has eyes, but the eyeballs, the glass and ivory have gone. And I found that image quite captivating. The glittering sort of multicoloredness of the design, but also the sort of the alien aspect, if you will, pardon that word, of the iconography as a child. Very, very clearly stuck in my head of like, this is a culture that is totally different from the one I've grown up in. If you I grew up in New Zealand. You grew up in the United States, I'm assuming. To a certain extent, we both grew up surrounded by the iconography and the philosophies of Greece and Rome. It adorns our public buildings. It shaped many of the philosophical movements that gave rise to our governments, and our political or social or economic organization were ultimately inspired by Greek and Roman philosophy. But as a 9-year-old, ancient Egypt was like, what is this? Like, this is so unusual and so strange, but it's got a really cool aesthetic appeal with all the gold. Like, that's, kind of a magpie or crow part of your brain is like, yes, that's really cool. That being said, I know from an early age I was one of those kids who just loved learning about history or dinosaurs and stuff like that. Anything that was unfamiliar and strange and old was cool. So it's entirely possible that if Egypt hadn't hooked me, something else like Mesopotamia, or Greece, or Rome would have done. And I came to those those societies as I grew older, and I started to want to branch out. So arguably, I fell in love with Egypt because it was the first one that hooked me. But I think there is, on its own terms, I think there's a great deal of almost underappreciatedness to ancient Egypt. I know that sounds strange because it's so famous and people are so fascinated by it. But there are so many aspects of ancient Egyptian religion and culture that I can't prove, but I feel must have filtered into the societies which ultimately shaped ours. I feel like there's a lot more, even if it's not direct, like there are more roots that go through ancient Egypt than we traditionally recognize. It's almost like we get to Greece and Rome and we're like, yep, that's where Western society begins. And it's like, well, hang on, where did they get their ideas? And some of the Greek philosophers openly acknowledged that to them, Egypt was the place of learning. That was the place of antiquity where they knew things that we can only barely figure out. And the more I learn about ancient Egypt, the more I see of it kind of filtering through to those societies, and the more I recognize. And again, I can't prove it, and I won't go into like strong details about that because I feel that deserves its own sort of discussion and presentation. But that's one of the things that keeps me coming back to it beyond personal interest, is this feeling that it's underappreciated, as bizarre as that may sound.
When we're looking at kind of the modern appreciation of ancient Egypt, you've got the various phases of Egyptomania and so on, where you've got like in the ancient Rome and in Napoleonic France, and then around the 20s with Tut's tomb being discovered. In more recent years, has there been any particular pop culture Egyptian material that you particularly enjoy, or does your position of knowledge in the field to say I can't get over the inaccuracies, or I can't get over the kind of Orientalism that you often see in these kinds of things?
My simple answer to that is if I never see another film about Cleopatra or the Exodus, I'll be happy. Because I'm so sick of those being the only films that Hollywood will go to when it wants to make a movie about ancient Egypt. Like, I think the guy who directed Dune, Denis Villeneuve, is also working on another Cleopatra film. And part of me just thinks, like, why? How many Cleopatras do we need? There have been like at least 20 films, miniseries, and documentaries about her, and I'm like, there's so much more to talk about than her. I get it, like, famous figure, Shakespeare immortalized, interacts with two of the most powerful Romans of the time at a crucial moment in history where the Roman Empire kind of solidified itself as what it became. But holy shit, like, like how many more times can you tell that story before you've just before the well has gone dry, so to speak? And it doesn't really help that like they kind of nailed it with like the Elizabeth Taylor version. Like, that is the full Shakespearean tale on film. Everything else has just been a sort of a retread of that. That was like the fullest expression of that. Was the Great Pyramid of Cleopatra films, if you will, and they've never been able to match it since. Ditto for the Exodus, like, we get it. There is this very famous and hugely influential story of these individuals and this supposed event, which obviously has had a massive impact on the societies in which we lived. But I don't need to see another film about it, especially if you're going to cast Christian Bale as Moses. Jesus. What I want to see is, I mean, I could write a book on the films I want to see. What I would quite like to see is just a really straightforward film or TV series, miniseries of even, about somebody like Hatshepsut and Tutmos III. Really interesting dynamic there. Tutmos III is a child when his father dies. Hatshepsut is the regent for him. And then at a certain point she says, hang on, no, I don't want to give up power. I'm going to make myself king. That's a really interesting political dynamic. What must have happened behind the scenes when that was going on? I'm sure it wasn't a smooth sailing. There must have been resistance, or at least debate, and sort of, can she do that? Like, how is this working? Even though there had been female rulers before, like, there must have been some anxiety around, like, hang on, we've already got a king. Can we have another one at the same time, and one who is a woman? That's begging for a really just solid, cool. Just give me a 2-hour film that is, that being figured out, and who wins, who loses, what throats get cut in the background of the palace, that kind of stuff. That's a cool political drama right there. Make that. But then there's other really simple ones, like Ramesses II. Why has nobody actually made a film about him that's not the Exodus? Why has nobody made like a biopic of Ramesses? That it seems like it would almost write itself. He's this larger than life figure, like a Napoleon. For the love of God, I hope they don't get Ridley Scott to direct that film about Ramesses, because
I was going to say, we did just see how that works out, and the answer's not
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like, Jesus. Love Ridley Scott's work most of the time, but sometimes he should not be allowed near a particular subject, especially if he doesn't really like that subject, like Napoleon. I mean, if you gave me an unlimited budget, like if Amazon came to me and said, we want to make Rings of Power, but ancient Egypt, I'd say, okay, first of all, you need to get somebody who's talented, which you have not done with the Rings of Power. If we're talking about Lord of the Rings, fuck the Rings of Power. You might want to cut that. I don't know. If Amazon came to me and said, here's $1 billion to make a five-season TV show, I'm like, the first thing that comes to mind is, you got to try Akhenaten, right? Like, whatever you think of him as a person, what was motivating him, he's such an unusual figure in the pharaonic lineage. The ideas that he's putting forth are not in themselves unique, like they have their antecedents in Egyptian history and religion, but he's this very distinctive, dynamic figure. That would make and then what comes after him, like the reign of Tutankhamun, the collapse and seizure of power by Horemheb. That's a great political drama, something like that.
Have you seen the movie The Egyptian before?
Yes, a long time ago. That's an interesting example, because that is an adaptation of an ancient Egyptian tale called the Tale of Sinuhe, which takes place about 500 or 600 years before Akhenaten. But then the novelist who wrote that story, the Egyptian, transposed that Egyptian fairy tale, if you will, into the reign of Akhenaten to kind of mix them together into a historical epic. And that's a cool film. It's old, it's dated, so it doesn't quite have the same panache as maybe a good modern adaptation might, although modern Hollywood, who can say? Yeah, I mean, I would also quite like to see like a workplace comedy about pyramid building, or the village of the tomb builders, Deir al-Medina. I'm like, there's got to be some stuff there that you could make some like a funny little 1-season sitcom out of. That could be fun. I will say that generally speaking, I don't consume much historical fiction set in ancient Egypt anymore, simply because it's too hard to turn off my work brain with that. Not even from like a critical point of view, but more just like I can't relax when I'm watching it, because I'm thinking about it too hard. I'm like paying attention, like, oh, what are they doing? What are they doing? What kind of details are they putting in there? So if I'm gonna get into historical fiction now, it has to be a culture that I don't know, that I don't work on professionally.
No, I understand that completely. I had the same thing like when I was watching the History Channel series Vikings, where it's no, that's okay. I see where they're going. Oh
Yeah.
no, that's wrong. That's wrong. That's
Yeah, I'm sure if you're at all interested in Norse or Anglo-Saxon England or any of the events around there, it would be very hard to watch. But to me, who's like, I don't know anything about this. This is entertaining. I'm having fun. That's a really good theme song. I like the guy who plays. I like the guy who plays Ragnar. He's captivating. But yeah, if it was ancient Egypt, I'm sure I'd be like, what have you done wrong here? Like, what is going on here? Or not even that, just like, you've used that for the costuming. Oh, that's quite interesting. And by that point, I'm not really paying attention. Yeah, so like, if I'm going to read historical fiction, I might read something like Bernard Cornwell's Last Kingdom series, because I don't know anything about that. I can just enjoy it. It's fun.
I got you. And I think that's kind of a decent spot to end this. I know we've been going at it for quite a while. This is going to be quite a long one for our viewers to get through, but this
I
has been an
apologize. I
excellent.
tend to talk too much.
No, no, no. I understand, and this is great. No, I'm very happy to have you on here. Is there anything that you would like to leave our audience with? Obviously, they can check out the History of Egypt podcast wherever they get their podcasts. Is there anything else you would like to leave our audience with?
I guess the key thing I would take away from this in the popular sense is that there is way more to ancient Egypt than pyramids and pharaohs. And the more you dive into the nitty-gritty of their society, their religion, their art, the more interesting and the more human they become. Ancient Egypt can seem very foreign and obscure, but just like you and me, they were people living their lives in an uncaring and unforgiving world, doing the best they could, figuring out things the best they could and what made sense to them. And the more you learn about them through their letters, their daily life tales, the more apparent it is that they're just like you and us. A few different reference points, slightly different outlook on the world, but with the same concerns. And I think that's the real interesting part.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.